Welcome to this episode of Against the Mountains of Madness. I'm your host, Jason.
And I'm John C. Wright.
And on this episode, we thought we'd chat about arguments for the existence of God, why they work, maybe they don't, and why we find them compelling. So, the classic place to start is probably with St. Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways. His 5 ways for the existence of God from the Summa Theologiae. An interesting, well, if you've ever read them in the Summa, Thomas is pretty hard going at times. He's and this is the book for beginners, no less. But
beginning theologians,
sure.
Which in the Middle Ages you were expected to be a master of many arts before you got to that level. So
fair enough. But Thomas has... We'll start with Thomas's 5 arguments. Some important things to note about them. St. Thomas was a thoroughgoing Aristotelian, committed to Aristotle's 4 causes, formal, efficient, material, and final causes. And his arguments are actually based in the assumption that these are true. Which leads in an interesting direction, because I'd certainly argue you can't really have a functional theory of causation that isn't Aristotle's or something very close to it. But St. Thomas's arguments, I would argue, have never actually been refuted. They've been perhaps abandoned, might be a better way to put it. But
ignored is the word you're looking for.
Ignored is the word I'm looking for. But I think his 5 ways are completely sound to get to the existence of, I think it would be fair to say, a very small sliver of God. One criticism that you will encounter when discussing this topic is you'll present something like the 5 ways only to be told, well, that could be any God. How is that the God of Christianity? Okay, it doesn't mean to prove that, but...
Yeah, that's a completely illegitimate counterattack.
Of course.
Because all you're saying is these are proofs to prove that God exists, not what his nature or his other properties are. The rest of the Summa Theologica is for that. But you have to establish the thing exists before you argue about what it's like.
Well, this is it. I mean, this is enough to show atheism is false. Beyond that,
yes.
Well, that's fine. We can continue to discuss it from there, but that's the first step. You got to start somewhere.
Right.
So, St. Thomas's 5 ways.
Greetings, world. This is John C. Wright. I and my compatriot, Jason Rennie, take up arms weekly against the mountains of madness that are afflicting and overwhelming the modern age. You are welcome here among like-minded souls, and I hope we have provided a work of insight, hope, or humor, and perhaps an explanation of the insanity that is the modern age. For more content and conversation on these and other fascinating topics of philosophy, science fiction, and current events, please visit our Substack at atmom.substack.com. Tips, bribes, and generous patronage are warmly encouraged. Thank you.
Yep.
St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 arguments in favor of the existence of God are based on Aristotle's 4 types of causation, as you mentioned in the opening. Those 4 types of causation, for those of you who are not familiar with it, include efficient cause, which is what we moderns think of as causation. The cause effect, like in time. The cue ball hits the 8 ball. That's efficient cause. Formal cause is the ball rolls because it's round, and the thing that makes the ball a ball is its roundness. Its roundness is the property of a solid object that has every point equidistant from a center point. That's what makes a ball round, is its roundness. Okay, it's form, right? Yeah. The material cause is what makes a ball, is it's made of ivory. That's why it's a ball and not something else. Because if it was made of something else, it wouldn't be a ball. If it was made of air or mud, it would not retain the ball shape of the billiard ball. The final cause is that the reason why the cue ball is hitting the 8 ball is because the two billiard players are playing a game and they want to win. It's the action toward which the ball is directed, and in this case it has 2 meanings. The ball itself is round, so that it will roll on a billiard table smoothly. Okay, because it needs to roll smoothly for the ball game to be fair. If the ball is misweighted or oblong or egg shaped, the game isn't gonna work.
Oh,
or what the intent is, what if it's a tool, what the intentional act is for. So that one is called final cause, is also called end cause or teleology.
Oh, we should note.
Now the reason why I'm insisting
John,
on these, go ahead.
It's important to note final or teleological causes. John's example of billiards players knocking balls around is agents doing something, but that's a final cause doesn't have to have a mind behind it.
I mentioned too. The other one is the ball is round for the sake of rolling. Anything that has a for the sake of which.
But like an acorn that grows into a what tree is it?
Oak tree.
Thank you.
Oak tree.
The acorn's final cause is to be an oak tree. It doesn't require a mind behind it for that to be the case.
It does require a mind behind it, but you and I can agree the acorn does not conceive in its imagination the desire to be an oak tree.
That's fair, yes. But
it has an end. It has an end purpose towards which actions are clearly directed.
Yes.
And even if you don't believe in the mind behind it, you can see that actions are directed toward an end. In that you cannot explain the actions, the motion. Why is it setting out roots? Why do the roots go down and the leaves go up? You can't explain that motion, that action, unless you understand the final purpose for which those actions are done.
Oh, you can't do you can't do biology without final causes.
You can't do biology
at all.
Right. Correct.
Biology is a fool's errand without final causes.
So those are the Aristotelian causes, and the reason why the dear viewers may not have ever heard of this is because it's never taught in school anymore.
No.
It's never discussed among philosophers, and it's certainly not discussed among scientists. I myself think there's probably a sinister reason for that. I think it's part of a kind of a world-girdling conspiracy of people to try to not think about certain topics that will make them uncomfortable. But I myself, as an amateur philosopher, I have to say you can't do philosophy without being familiar with the fact that there's more than one reason why a thing could be a thing. Even in what's the problem with the modern world, if I can just digress for a second, is one of the major problems is we all tend to think like scientists when we come to talking about philosophy. But we should be thinking like lawyers, because a lawyer will say, well, why was the victim shot with a gun? And the answer could either be he was shot with a gun because our ballistics experts say that this gun of this weight with this caliber of bullet came from this explosive chamber on such and such a date at such and such a time, and struck the guy in the cerebral cortex and killed him. That's the mechanical cause.
That's the efficient cause. And material cause.
But to be a lawyer, you also have to prove that it was with malice aforethought and not an accident if you want to prove first-degree murder. You have to prove what the intent was. See? So, if you think in a more lawyerly fashion, then you can put the universe on trial, you can put the cosmos on trial, and try to find out whether or not it is an accident or whether it's deliberate, whether it was made by a maker, created by a creator. So, putting the universe on trial for a second, let's see what the 5 arguments are if you want to try to argue that it was made by a creator. The first is the argument from motion. And by motion, I mean not just physical motion through time, but I also mean any kind of change.
Yep.
I both mean a billiard ball, the cue ball hitting the 8 ball, and I mean the acorn growing into an oak. Those are both types of motion. Okay?
Yep.
Now, in all of these arguments, I'm going to refer to an idea called infinite regress. And infinite regress means you can't explain something by offering an explanation that is itself unexplained, that in turn is only explainable in terms of another explanation that you can't explain. And you can't do that infinitely. You can't say A is caused by B, B is caused by C, C is caused by D, but what causes D? You can't have that go on infinitely, because then there's no reason for it. Let me use 1 or 2 examples just to make this clear, because this is often misunderstood. If you're in a car and you pull up to a railroad crossing, and you see one freight car after another is zipping past the street you're in, and you can't see the head or the tail of the train, okay? Mm-hmm. And your child in the back seat goes, "Daddy, why is that car moving past us at 30 miles an hour?" Let's say it's a very intelligent young man, your son, and you say, "Well, car A is moving past us at 30 miles an hour because it's being pulled by car B, which is moving at 30 miles an hour." Okay, well, why is car B moving at that speed, Daddy? Well, because the car ahead of it, car C, is also 30 miles an hour. Okay, well, what is at the beginning of the train? If you say there is no beginning to the train, this train encircles the entire Earth on a railroad track with no beginning and no end and just speeds by at 30 miles an hour, okay, that's no answer. That means that 30 miles an hour is merely a given, a raw fact that you can't explain. It's a non-answer. Okay? You can't just say the train car is moving because the one in front of it's moving, because the one in front of it's moving, because the one in front of it's moving, and so on and so forth. Ad infinitum. There's no ad infinitum. There has to be an engine that set the train in motion, that decided, someone had to decide that it was going to go 30 miles an hour and not 15 and not 60. Okay? Likewise, if you're in a car and you come up to a number line and your son in the back seat says, Daddy, why is there a number line ahead of us? Because those are imaginary concepts. How can we see through the car window? You can just say, shut up, child. You're a hypothetical child anyway. But you shouldn't be that rude to your child. But you can say, no matter what the number is, no matter how high or low the number is, there's got to be a number called 1 for this number to be a multiple of. Because any number divided by itself is 1. Okay? A number is just a multitude of magnitudes. You have to have a unit length for the number to be a multiple of. So the very existence of a number line proves it has to be a number 1, which is not a multiple of anything but itself. 1 is equal to 1. 1 is 1. A is A. And for the same reason, if you're in a car and you pull up to a gate at a military base, and the corporal says, stop, I've been ordered to stop you, and you say, who ordered you to order me to stop me? And your son says, are you sure I'm the hypothetical one, Dad? Are you not hypothetical yourself? And you get quiet. The corporal says the sergeant told him. So you say, well, who told the sergeant to tell me to stop? Why am I being stopped? The sergeant says, the captain told me. And the captain says, well, the major told me. And the major says, well, the brigadier told me. Okay, there's got to be someone, a general or a king or something, there's got to be a commander-in-chief who actually made the order, who can tell you why it is the way it is and not some other way. See? So when I talk about there's no such thing as an infinite regress, that's what I mean. It's in order to understand why something is the way it is, when it could have been another way, you have to understand where it starts from, and everything's got to start from somewhere, because nothing comes from nothing. That's the fundamental premise of all scientific thinking, all legal thinking, all rational thinking. If you think that modern science has proved that things arise for no reason out of just statistically, then you don't understand modern science. So I'm sorry.
Well,
now
on that point,
yes, go ahead.
I saw someone saying the other day, my son understands quantum mechanics, and he says there's 4 or 5 different theories for how you get a universe out of nothing. I chuckled a little bit. I haven't talked to his son, but I've certainly seen lots of these. This is how you get a universe from nothing arguments, and every single one of them redefines nothing as something, in my experience.
Yeah, you need to get a universe out of nothing. You need a highly energetic and highly actualized nothing that has infinite potential, and that somehow contains all the matter, energy, and potential of an entire universe.
Which I'm pretty sure
that's not what you and I would call the word nothing.
Pretty sure
I call that something.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Right.
That's a something.
That's a something.
I mean, I'm fine if you want to argue.
And likewise,
you can get all of the universe out of quantum mechanics if you just start with quantum mechanics and an empty void. And it's like, okay, that's fine, but that's not nothing. But
you can't, because quantum mechanics establishes that there's certain chains of cause and effect that the human mind cannot perceive the origin of. We can only tell out of 100 cases how many cases the thing will happen. That's what statistics means. That doesn't mean that's the cause of it. That's just the form of it.
Oh, sure. But I mean, I guess my point is more. That's why I don't have a problem if you want to make an argument. If we start with something, then we can get something from it. Okay, that's fine. But don't pretend that's nothing. You're lying to me.
Yeah, that's not nothing.
You're lying to yourself if you believe that you're actually telling me you're getting something from nothing, because you're not.
Yeah, what you're calling nothing is the axiomatic uncaused first cause. That's what they're calling nothing, and then they say the uncaused first cause does something for no reason. Okay, you've left the path of science and you've left the path of sanity once you say that something can arise from nothing for no reason. There's no point in looking for the reason for anything if things happen for no reason, or if So let's just take it as an axiom that nothing can come from nothing.
Which is fair.
Okay, so let's go through Thomas's five arguments.
Sure.
The first argument is the argument from motion, and by motion I mean not just motion in time, but motion in growth, any kind of motion. So nothing moves by itself because nothing comes from nothing. So everything that moves is moved by a mover. Mm-hmm. If you look at something in motion, you can see what set it in motion, and if you look at what set that in motion, you can see what set that in motion. Okay, but we just established with my long elaborate intro, there's no infinite regress. So there's no motion. You can't have a chain of motion without an unmoved mover who is the first mover. The same way you can't have a number line without a number one. We observe motion in the universe. Therefore, there is an unmoved mover. And this all men know to be God. Second, argument from cause and effect. Since nothing comes from nothing, everything has to be caused by a cause. Every effect has to have a cause. There's no infinite regress, so there's no chain of cause and effect unless you have an uncaused first cause at the start of that chain of effect.
Yep.
We observe effects. We can see cause and effect operating in the universe around us. Therefore, there has to be an uncaused first cause. And this all men know to be God. Third, argument from contingency and necessity. Necessary facts are things that have to be the way they are because they can't be any other way. 2 + 2 is always equal to 4. It has to be. It's a necessary fact.
Wow.
But no, 2 and 2 has to be 4. There's no argument there.
Of course, but you will.
That's necessary.
There was a little while ago. It was a trendy to argue this was not the case, and then just
those people's arguments is nonsensical. The only way you can get that argument is by redefining your terms so as to make them meaningless.
That's essentially what they did. But
yeah,
continue.
There are certain things that are necessary and certain things that are not necessary. Things that are not necessary are called contingent. A contingent fact is a fact that could be one way or could be another way without any breach of logic. So if I hold a white cup in my hand and you ask the question, well, why is this a cup? I can say, well, it's a cup because it's cup shaped, referring to the shape for which it is made. I can say because it's made of a substance, made of plastic in this case. And I can say it's white because the reason why it's a white cup is because the molecules are so arranged in the surface that the white light is reflected back to my eye. Okay? Now, this cup could have been black or yellow or any other color. So why is it white? Now, if I answer it's white because light's reflected back to my eye, then I'm arguing that that the contingent fact is based on another contingent fact. In this case, it's that way because the electromagnetics in this universe operates in a certain way, as does the human eye. Okay? It operates according to the 4 laws of Maxwell. So then you say, well, why are Maxwell's laws the way they are? And why are the laws of nature the way they are? Now, at some point, laws of nature could be otherwise without being logical, but the laws of nature have to be derived from some sort of laws of logic, which can't be otherwise, and they have to have been set in motion by something that decided that it would be that way as opposed to not that way, you see? So, no matter how you slice it, you have to go from any group of contingent facts has to be dependent on other contingent facts that are dependent on some necessary fact. So there has to be at least one necessary fact that is necessarily true. All contingent beings have to be based on a necessary being. Now, we can see that contingent beings exist around us. There are things around us that are the way they are and could have been otherwise.
Yep.
I mean, I could have picked a different way to word the sentence, which might have been more clear, but I didn't. Okay, so somewhere behind that chain of necessity and contingency, there has to be a necessary being, a being that is the way it is and cannot be another way. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, this all men know to be God. The necessary being is the being that has to be as he is, and the only being that fits that definition is God. He's got to be perfect because he's perfect. He's got to be omnipotent because he's omnipotent. He's got to be omniscient because he's omniscient. He's got to be all the things that he is because it can't be any other way. If he were some other way, he wouldn't be God. Okay? Now, I want to pause here and note that St. Anselm makes an ontological argument that attempts to define into existence that a God is that of which none greater can be conceived, and since an existing God is greater than a non-existing God, obviously God must exist. That argument doesn't hold water, and Anselm criticizes it because it's an a priori argument. It's an argument that you make before you look at the evidence. But this argument says, we see, when we put the universe on trial, we can see that there's necessary beings and contingent beings. There are things that can't be another way than they are, and there's things that are that can be another way than the way they are. You see? Necessary has to be as it is, and contingent can be otherwise. Well, that means my argument is a posteriori. My argument is based on evidence. Okay? I can see that there are contingent beings. I can deduce that contingent beings have to be based on a necessity. For the same reason I can deduce that even if I don't see it, that there has to be an engine pulling the train. The same way I can deduce, even if I never meet him, that there has to be a commander-in-chief who gave the command to the sergeant, who gave the command to the corporal, who won't let me into the military base. Okay? That's the third argument. We're only on 3. The fourth one is the argument of comparative and absolute. Now, this one I don't think is as tight as his other arguments, but I'll repeat it anyway. No standard compares itself. You can't use a yardstick to measure a yardstick. Okay? You can only compare something in relation to another standard, and that can only be compared in relation to an absolute standard. You can't have nothing can be hot or cold unless there's such a thing as a hottest thing. You can't have there's no such thing as good and bad without a best. Nothing is more perfect or less perfect unless there's such a thing as perfect. Otherwise, the words don't have any meaning. Okay. Now, by the same reason that you can't have an infinite regress, you can't say this is colder and that's colder and this colder and we can tell what's cold unless there's an absolute 0 point. So you can't have a standard of good, better, and best unless there is an absolute good that is the most perfect. You see? Now, in life, we observe some things are good and some are bad. So there has to be something to which all beings find the cause of their own being, of their goodness, and of every other perfection. And this all men know to be God. There's no such thing as good and bad unless there's better and best. And best can't be best unless God exists. God is the best. God is the perfection of which all the imperfect things are compared. Now, the reason why I think that argument's a little weak is because I can imagine hotter and colder if we lived in a universe where there's no hottest temperature. There's no temperature above which you can't add one more degree of temperature. The same way I can imagine a number line, I can always add one more number to any given number. I can't imagine anything colder than absolute 0 because temperature is based on how molecules vibrate, and once they've stopped, you can't get colder than stopped.
Well,
you see?
I mean...
So I don't know if God is a thing like that. I don't know if his argument proves that there must be a perfect standard against which all imperfections are measured as a standard.
They're probably, if you're going to say heat depends on molecules and their motion, the hottest temperature would be the temperature at which the molecules cease to exist.
That seems fair to me.
There'll be a point where if you heat them enough, they'll come apart, I think.
Well, in that case, my example falls apart. And so maybe the argument does completely hold stand. Don't make fun of medieval thinkers. They've already outsmarted you. So, argument from design. This is an argument that is the most often misunderstood argument I've ever heard. Sometimes it's called the watchmaker argument, but it's a mistake. The watchmaker argument goes something like this: you're walking through a wasteland where there's no people around. You find a watch you find a watch on a rock. It's clearly meant to tell time. Could something that complicated have been put together by accident? Okay? No matter how you answer that question, that's not what the argument is. The argument is if you're walking through the desert and you come across a thing that was made for a purpose, and the watch itself did not invent the purpose, I wish to tell time, I want to measure time. Someone made the watch. Someone with that purpose in mind made the watch. So
yeah, it exists for
let's step back from the watch and the watchmaker and talk about Aquinas for a second. Thomas Aquinas. He says that any being that acts toward a deliberate end, toward an end, either does the deliberation itself, decides on the thing it's aimed at, or is aimed by another. Something has to for it to be a deliberate action, someone has to do the deliberation. For it to be an action aimed at an end, it either has to know that end springs from that action, because it's in the future, it's anticipatory, or it has to be aimed by a knower. So either the runner runs toward the target, or the arrow is shot toward the target. But in the case of the arrow, it's not the arrow who aims the arrow, it's the archer who aims the arrow. If something has an aim, there has to be an archer that aims it, or he himself is moving himself that direction. Okay? Now, we can observe that natural beings act toward ends. We can observe that the acorn unfolds into a tree in order to absorb sunlight, in order to seek moisture under the soil. We can observe that a squirrel gathers nuts in the fall in order to have a supply during the winter. There are things that animals do that are directed toward an end, you see. But the animal himself, if you question him, doesn't have that idea in mind. The acorn did not envision an oak tree and get an ambition. So something else must be directing it toward that end. Okay? The bird did not design the bird wing.
No.
But clearly the wing is designed for flying. And the wing couldn't fly without being designed or being meant to or being aimed at flying. Therefore, nature is designed by a designer. And this all men know to be God.
Well, I would not...
Those are my sum up and simplification, and I left out a lot of nuance of the five arguments from Aquinas.
That's reasonable. Certainly the final one, the argument from design, I'm always amused when people dismiss it because, I mean, like you said, they don't really understand it. But
Right.
and Paley's argument is bad. Paley's watchmaker argument is a bad argument. I mean, it sort of has its merits, but it's
all Paley
reasonably-
proves is that the thing is complex, but complexity could arise from nature without intention. But intentional action cannot arise without intention.
I think actually some of the intelligent design guys make a pretty good argument that you can't really get the complexity we see via steps leading up to it without. I think where they miss the point is you can get anywhere from anywhere if you're if you allow for intention. I think it was Peter Kreeft said Aquinas probably would have thought would have looked at sort of Darwin's theory of evolution and said, oh yeah, that's just, I mean, that's design in action. These things are all starting from something simpler and working towards a particular goal over the generations. If that makes sense. I'm probably butchering that, but
The goal, you are butchering it. The goal in Darwin's case is survival, and it's fecundity and survivability.
well, no, that's not true. This
And Darwin kind of denies that it's a purposeful intentionality.
well, no, this
People who came after
yeah.
Darwin tried to attribute ever increasing complexity or ever increasing fineness of life to what Darwin said, but he did not say any such thing.
Sure, no, but what I'm saying though is like, because that whole sort of story makes perfect sense. Well, if you allow teleology that this is, like life was aimed at producing human beings and things like that.
But Darwin doesn't say that. In fact, he goes way out of his way to avoid
No,
saying
that's what I'm
that.
saying. He explicitly denies that, but you can't. The argument doesn't work as soon as you disallow teleology. This is the thing. I mean,
Right. What they're trying to do, honestly, is they're trying to get teleology from efficient cause without the aid of a teleology.
Yeah.
And the example that I've seen used is a game called automaton game, where if you have a checkerboard, you can flip a counter white or black depending on what the other checkers around it are, and you can end up with fairly complicated and even self-replicating patterns on like a Go game.
Oh yeah, the game of
The
life.
problem with that is what's that? Game of Life.
Game of
Okay, I
Life.
forgot what it's called.
That's what it's called.
The problem with the Game of Life is it only can be set up if a computer programmer sets it up to run that way. So they're using the example of a programmer who programs something as an example to show that nature doesn't have a programmer.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, that simply doesn't work as an analogy.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that if you think about it, yeah, there's an underlying set of rules that produce these results. Okay, sure,
Right.
I can concede that.
Sure.
That's Aquinas' argument from design. I mean,
Right.
like
Right.
that sort of, or that would be one possible application of.
But even in the Game of Life, one of the rules is that if a black square is surrounded by two white squares, it flips white. That's the intention. It's for the sake of doing that the rule is set up. Okay. Now, if you were a Darwinian, you could say, well, the organism doesn't intend to survive, but it just so happens that anything that survives will pass its genes along. In which case I say, okay, why? Why does it do that? And if he says it just does, it's just a raw fact, I go, okay, you don't understand why. That's not an explanation. That's like saying the sergeant gave the order to the corporal because he gave the order to the corporal. Okay? It's like saying, well, gravity pulls things toward the earth because it pulls things toward the earth. That's a true statement. It's a tautology. It's true. But it doesn't explain why anything happens. And certainly doesn't have the predictive power that a scientific statement is supposed to have.
No.
It's basically Darwinism is a philosophical stance pretending to be a scientific theory. And the philosophical stance is that you can explain teleology without reference to teleology, which is logically absurd.
This is certainly true. I mean, certainly, if I'm discussing this with someone, my question is always, explain to me how the heart works without reference to its function, which would be a teleological explanation. And you can't make sense of it. You cannot make sense of what a heart does without You'll never make sense of what a heart does without the statement, it's designed to pump blood. It pumps blood around the body. But
The other argument from design argument,
the
other argument from design argument is a Paley argument and not a Thomist argument. And the Paley argument is the thing itself is so complex that just statistically speaking, it cannot arise by trial and error, because there's no filter between trial and error. A bird with half a wing can't fly. A bird with an instinct to put it down the first stick of the nest, but not the rest of the nest, won't build a nest. You say there's no way to explain the lack of intermediary stages.
And that's a reasonable argument.
We don't have mutations that merely do a bunch of random things, all of which have some survival value, and then, I mean, if you just randomly change things, you would have one survivor and 100 dead for every live birth.
Well,
you see, and we don't see that.
No, that's true. We don't. But
we don't see beneficial mutations. Most mutations lead to death.
But
so the mutation theory is not the mechanism. If the Darwinians want to change and become Lamarckians and say there was an ongoing purpose that could be passed from father to son, not through the genetic code but through some other mechanism of which we are as yet unaware, I'd be satisfied. I'd be willing to say. But we're getting way away from Aquinas proving God exists.
No, I agree.
No matter what the mechanism is for evolution, whether you believe in evolution or not, if you believe in everything evolutionists say, you still have to say, why is this here as opposed to some other way?
Oh, it doesn't really avoid,
and you have
it
to
doesn't
say,
solve the problem at all.
No, because then evolution is designed to preserve life. Well, why? It's still intentional. And for the intentional act to exist in nature, there has to be something behind nature that has the intention.
But
so the argument from design still operates.
No, I agree.
Evolution was designed to produce healthy offspring, to reward healthy offspring by a statistical survival of the fittest. Well, who set up that game?
Yeah.
Who wrote the rules of the game of life?
Now, we should note though. So I said at the start. Did I say at the start? I don't think these arguments have ever been refuted.
No, they've just been ignored.
But the way they've been ignored was, so these arguments go back. Some of them go back to Aristotle. They're based in Aristotle's theory of causation.
That was the introductory comment. You said that right at the beginning.
But before St. Thomas, I guess you could be an atheist if you wanted to be. But after St. Thomas, you're stuck. If you're going to keep Aristotle's theory of causation, you can't.
Right.
You can't have. You can't be an atheist because you'll run smack bang into this argument or these set of arguments, which have never been, to my knowledge, decisively shown to be in error. The reason they are dismissed these days is philosophers decided to go, well, we'll get away without formal causes and without final causes. We'll just have a stripped down version of efficient and material causes, and then we won't need to deal with St. Thomas's arguments because they won't apply because they require Aristotle in the background. The problem with that problem is that it creates more problems than it solves. Oh, it definitely does.
Once you believe in nothing but a stripped down version of material cause and efficient cause, you're a materialist.
Everything.
And once you're a materialist, materialism can explain everything in the universe except for the philosophy of materialism. Because in order to have a philosophy, you have to have a thinker. In order to have a thinker, thoughts have to be directed toward an end.
Well, true.
In order for thoughts to be directed toward an end, you have to have a final cause.
But worse than that.
So a materialist can explain everything as a meat robot except for himself. Because if he's a meat robot, then his thoughts don't reflect reality. He's just a robot. He's only saying what he's been programmed to say. He is no more intelligent than a tape recorder, playing back what it was recorded into it by an unintelligent speaker.
Well,
so no.
This is it.
Almost all modern philosophy has this same problem. They're all the idiot gardener who is sawing off the branch he is sitting on. Okay, they all undermine the premise that they assume in order to make their arguments. And I mean all of them. Nietzsche assumes that things can be beyond good and evil, and he assumes it's good to be beyond good and evil. He assumes the premise that he denies. Marx assumes that the content of your philosophy is based on your self-interest of your economic class, which is produced by historical causes created by the means of production. Or in other words, that you've been programmed to think what you think. But if everyone's been programmed to think what he thinks, then that includes Marx. Which means that everything he's saying is just pre-programming. If you're Skinnerian Skinner says that everything in your brain is pre-programmed. It's programmed like a computer, like a clockwork. But if that's true, then Skinnerism is the outcome of a clockwork process, not an intelligent argument meant to persuade a rational listener.
No, none of these arguments are rational.
And on and on for all of them.
Well,
so that's why it's because Thomas got to a fundamental truth that they flinched back from because they're evil, and I'm sorry, they are. That's really why. I've never been an atheist who had a good argument against adultery. Okay. I read Ayn Rand. She was an atheist I admired when I was young. And she was an adulteress. Okay. I've seen other atheists who have no problem with pornography or with drug abuse or with anything else that demeans the human spirit because they don't believe in the human spirit. Or if they do, they don't believe in it literally. See? So, and I should say, these are just the formal arguments meant for philosophers as to why to believe in God. I could come up with another 5 arguments just as handy, just based on legal, experiential, or practical arguments for such a thing. These aren't the only arrows in the quiver.
No, of course not.
You see? But the atheist argument is almost always what we philosophers call epistemological. They say, well, if God is infinite and is a spiritual being, that he can't be known. Or I don't believe in God because there's no good reason to believe in God. Okay, well, by that same argument, I don't disbelieve in God because there's no good reason to disbelieve in God. I mean, ball's in your court, buddy. You're the one making the extraordinary claim. You're the one making a claim that no one on earth has ever made, except for a few small crackpots. There were atheists in ancient Greece who said, if horses and cows made gods, then they'd make them in the shape of horses and cows. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was saying Democritus and Lucretius and some others.
Right. Lucretius technically believed in gods, but he believed that they were made of atoms that were small and fine, and the gods existed in a state of pure bliss, so they would never be bothered to listen to human prayers. So he believed in gods that weren't really gods, even though he starts his poem with a prayer to Venus, the mother of the Roman race, because Venus was the father of Aeneas, and Aeneas founded Rome. So take that as you will. Good old Lucretius. I was a fan of Lucretius in my atheist youth.
Fair enough.
Now, the big problem with the argument from Thomas is not any of these arguments. As you can see, I broke them down into simple syllogisms. Nothing moves by itself. There's no infinite regress. Therefore, there has to be an unmoved mover. But the problem is that most people these days don't think reason is reasonable. They think reason is racist. They don't think logic is logical. They think logic is a trick. They don't think truth is true. They think truth is a subjective opinion. They believe in feelings rather than truth.
Well, they've lost their minds.
So they've lost their minds. They don't believe that mind is mind. They believe mind is robotics.
Actually, that's not fair. It's not. I don't think it's fair to say they've lost their minds, although it's certainly true. It would be fairer to say their minds were stolen from them. Like, this was their birthright. The birthright of civilization has been stolen from people today.
Yes. That would be a fair way to say it. If you raise a child and teach him always to refer to his feelings rather than to his reason to determine true and false, and you tell him no matter what he does, he's a winner, and you tell him no matter what he thinks, his thoughts are as good as anyone else's, you've achieved the kind of libertarian, liberal, left-wing apotheosis of individualism, where every man is godlike. Every man has personal autonomy over reality. So that even his sex is a matter of his personal opinion, and his opinion is just as good as yours, because there's no truth, there's no yardstick, there's no reality to refer to.
Well, I've always
these guys actually put reality on trial and condemn it, and they say no, reality does not exist. Reality is not real.
I think it's I don't know. People might disagree with me, but I think the people today are the children of Nietzsche, and this is what we are seeing is essentially what Nietzsche was aiming for with the will to power.
Yes.
Which, as far as I can tell, my understanding of Nietzsche is the will to power is essentially my bending reality to my will, asserting my will against reality and having reality under my control.
Bravo. Yes, exactly.
The thing is, all I can say is, I wonder what Nietzsche would have made of his Supermen in the trans movement today. Because there is no better example of people who are seeking to assert their will against reality. More fundamental, like this is Nietzsche's Superman.
By the logic of his position, he would have to approve, no matter what he himself thought personally.
Well, I wonder whether.
And if you've ever seen these guys dress up in face paint and horns and going in front of Congress to testify, dressed like demons,
always, yeah,
then you will know that why Nietzsche ended up his life in a madhouse. He actually was insane. He actually did lose his mind, and no matter what you say of him, his insights were profound in some way, but he wasn't able to accept. He wasn't able to see what the conclusions to which his axioms pointed.
Well, I think,
and when you start with the axiom of a will to power, then you end with reality is not real.
Well, I think that's the thing with Nietzsche. Like, he started in the wrong place, and so he ended somewhere mad. But he was at least willing to try to follow his conclusions, at least to follow his ideas where the logic went. The problem he made, like Peter Singer, actually, they both sort of make the same error, which is when you get to a place that's clearly insane, you have to question your premises and go, no, I've made a mistake somewhere at the start because I've reached this abominable conclusion.
If I may, I heard the best definition ever for ideology. As you and I both know, ideology is what you get once you use religion. Mm. And what an ideology is an ideologist is a guy who takes ideas as primary, and then reality has to be warped to conform with the ideas. And ideology is something that believes in the ideal and rejects reality. Okay, and theology is something that starts with reality and affirms that the reality is real.
So yes.
So do you want to hear 5 more arguments above and beyond the Thomas's?
Sure, I'm keen.
And then you and I can speak about whether or why we find these persuasive, because some I find more persuasive than others. I've already mentioned that I'm not sure the argument from gradation. Just because there's better and worse doesn't necessarily mean there has to be an absolute good. I believe there is an absolute good, but I'm not sure if the argument necessarily follows.
I would note, all of the arguments don't have to be perfect to comprise a weight of evidence that leads you to the conclusion. In lawyer talk,
we say the argument is probative without being dispositive. That's what lawyers would phrase it. The argument carries weight, but it doesn't necessarily prove the case.
Well, but there's certainly beyond a reasonable doubt, and I think we get to at least that.
Yeah, I don't think the doubts of God's existence are reasonable at this point.
I think to some degree we even get to beyond a certain degree of unreasonable doubt as well.
In order to not believe in God, you have to believe first that there's no meaning innate in the universe. Okay? Now, if you then say that you as a human can make your own meaning, you are in effect saying that meaning is meaningless, because if I can make meaning, I can unmake it. If it's based on my will, then I can change it. Any law that I make as sovereign, I can amend or abolish as sovereign. So if there's no law higher than human law, then all human laws are arbitrary. Okay. Now, there's plenty of people who wander around the world these days saying everything is arbitrary.
Well, yes.
And I simply claim, well, your claim that everything's arbitrary is also arbitrary then.
They've been
it's completely unpersuasive, because if everything's arbitrary, then there's nothing wrong with everything being arbitrary. If there's no such thing as good and evil, then there's nothing evil about me asserting there is such a thing as good and evil. You can't criticize me on any grounds once you say there's no such thing as good and evil.
Yeah.
You see? And once you say everything's arbitrary and life is meaningless unless you find a meaning, I say you can find a meaning but not invent a meaning. And the only way to find a meaning is if there's meaning in the universe. Meaning means intention. Meaning means deliberate. Meaning means design.
Yeah.
It's got to be discovered. But it's not there to be discovered unless there's a creator, unless there's a designer, unless there's something that intentionally put the meaning of the universe into the universe. That means that there has to be a universe maker. That means meaning has to be real. Reality has to be real.
Well, actually, I would note, for meaning, all you require is final causes. You don't necessarily require God. That being said,
I say you necessarily require God because what final causes themselves depend on ultimate final causes.
Well, hang on.
Every to return to Aristotle's causation, every good has to be aimed at a higher good, but you can't have an infinite regress, so there has to be a highest good at which all things are aimed. And this is the absolute good, and this all men know to be God.
Hang on. I would note, I was just saying, back up a step. I was saying,
Sure.
to have morality and to have meaning, you need final causation. If you've got final causes, your life has a point. It's meant to be lived a certain way. You get morality and meaning from that.
Right.
You don't technically require God. You just require final causes. No, hang on. But you just require final causes to get what you need. The problem is then you immediately run smack into St. Thomas's argument, and you've got the existence of God. So, but
well, that's what I said. You have final causes, but those final causes themselves depend on higher final causes.
Of course, that's the problem.
And you can't have an infinite tower of. You can't have an infinite tower of final causes piled up like the Tower of Babel.
Of course.
It has to descend from an ultimate final cause, an absolute good, of which all lesser goods are reflections.
Of course, that's the problem with final causes. But I'm just saying, like, as a first step, you could say, well, no,
sure.
There is a final cause to human existence. That's and that gives you meaning and morality.
Granted.
Because things are meant to be used a certain way. You could, in theory, stop there. I don't think you can. I don't think that works.
I have heard secular right-wingers say that society should adopt Christian values and morals because they are beautiful, useful, and good for pragmatic reasons, and without saying without saying what the justification is for that, and just say these should be held to be unquestionable, even though I don't know why they should be this way as opposed to another way. I'm going to treat them as a necessary fact, even though I know they're a contingent fact. My answer is you could do that for any one of Thomas's 5 arguments. You could say, I see that there's motion. I can see there's a train car being pulled by the previous train car. As a scientist, I will only humbly say the previous train car pulls it. I will not speculate as to whether there's an engine or not. Okay, well, sure, but that's the nature of the question as to why this train car is moving 30 miles an hour as opposed to 60 as opposed to 15. You're not answering the question.
No,
okay,
I get it.
I can assume that a Christian society has more freedom, health, joy, survivability, and justice in it than a cruel pagan society. We don't have gladiatorial games as the Romans did. We don't have widespread pederasty. Well, we do nowadays. Now we're no longer Christian. Yeah. But and you could say, well, I dislike those things. To which I answer, if there's no God, your dislike is arbitrary. It's something you decided or your ancestors decided.
No, I agree.
Okay,
I agree with
you.
So
it's true for all the arguments. If you don't take the argument to its ultimate logical extreme, then you can't actually put reality on trial to find out whether reality is real or not. You can take it as, I'll treat it as real for today. Okay, no. Thank you, Mr. Pragmatic. You're not a philosopher.
I get it.
You're not going to be able to answer anyone's questions when they question you. So,
I get it.
And we Christians are supposed to stand ready with an answer when someone questions the faith we have within us.
No, I get it.
Go ahead.
No, I get it. I just wanted to make the point that, like, technically what you need are final causes. As long as you have final causes, you can make sense. Right. You can solve a lot of these problems. The difficulty is you run straight into St. Thomas as soon as you have a final cause. You can't escape that. So you're stuck. But technically, you could say the Stoics had final causes. The Stoics gave us natural law.
The Stoics believed in God. The Stoics called him Zeus, but they actually had prayers to God. They believed in God. They thought the stars were divine beings made of ethereal substances that were imperishable. They thought they could look up and see the spirit world that the heavens above them.
Oh, fair enough. I stand corrected.
Now, and keep in mind, all that I know this because I used to be a Stoic, even though I was an atheist Stoic, so go figure.
Well, no, but Stoicism is basically how to live a good life in this life. It doesn't seem overly concerned with the next life as such.
Please read Epictetus. He says that God is the one who gives you the tools you need
to
live your life in serenity. And their goal was serenity. Their goal was ataraxia, which is a tranquility. And they sought tranquility through denying that they had desires attached to the outside world. Their only desire was to conform to reality. You see? So that's the stuff. But keep in mind, the God that is being described by Thomas's 5 arguments, we said this at the beginning, it's not necessarily the Christian God yet. That's what the rest of the Summa Theologica is for. Right now, it's just a deist kind of God. It could be any sort of monotheistic, ultimate good God. It can't be a polytheistic God because it's got to be one principle.
No,
the good.
You'll quickly rule out a few bits and pieces. Yeah.
Yes, it's got to be the uncaused first cause. It's got to be the necessary being, and so on and so forth. Now, let's roll over some real quick other arguments because these are also arguments.
Yes.
Let me see. We have within the next 10, 15 minutes.
Well, we've touched on some of these. The argument for morality and
the argument for
meaning are two sides of the same coin.
Two sides of the same coin. I say you can't have morality unless there's an objective morality. And you can't have an objective morality unless there's an objective lawgiver to whom you owe fealty. You see? You can't have a law without a lawgiver. It's not a law then. It's just advice. It's just an appeal to your pragmatism. You can say to someone, I advise you to wear a helmet when you're riding a motorcycle because it would be wise not to suffer head injury. But you can't say to someone, I order you not to drive a motorcycle without a helmet unless you have authority, unless you have command. Right? You see the difference?
Oh, yeah.
One's in the imperative mode, and the other is in the is a matter of fact, statement of fact. See? Now, many an atheist can concoct a moral scheme based on wisdom. They can say it'd be practical to do these things. But what you can't do is say you ought to do these things. You're commanded to do these things. It is your duty to do these things. To get to duties, you have to have a duty giver. You have to have a spirit authority.
Well, you need final causes.
You need final clauses. But you also need moral authority.
That's
and
true.
if it's not man-made, if it's man-made, then it's arbitrary. If you made the rule that I ought to do something, I should do this because I took an oath. Okay, that's a good reason. If there's no God, you believe that either because it's your arbitrary decision or it is a decision of your ancestors, the people who raised you.
Why should you keep oaths? Yes.
Right. Why should you keep oath? Well, I swore an oath to keep an oath. Okay, that's a good answer for now. But once you that's like the guy who says, well, I have a final cause, but I'm not going to look at what the ultimate final cause is.
Of course, it's the same,
Okay.
and meaning is essentially the same.
Meaning's the same way.
Meaning and morality
Meaning's the same way.
they're two sides of the same sort of argument. There's a proper
Right.
way to live. There's a way your life is meant to go. There's a point your life is aimed at, and I mean that's meaning as well as final
Right.
cause, and morality is derived from that.
Right.
You have,
Now, here's an argument that I've never heard anyone else make, which is the argument from mental efficiency. An unlettered man who is trained up in the Bible knows that the purpose of life is to know, love, and serve the Lord. Mm-hmm. He knows what the meaning of life is. A philosopher who doesn't believe in God can calculate and debate and talk with the sages of East and West and not know what the meaning of life is. You see, he has to reinvent the wheel. That's not efficient. That's a waste of his time. Because by the time he reinvents the wheel, I speak from personal experience, he finally gets to the conclusion that his purpose in life is to love, know, and serve the Lord. Okay? But it's a waste of your time not to believe in God because you have to go through all the rigmarole to end up realizing the universe is meaningless without it. The universe doesn't make any sense without it. It's an Occam's razor argument. The universe that has God in charge makes more sense than the universe without God in charge.
Yep.
You see, that's now. There's also an argument from supernature, which goes like this. This is a very simple argument. Either you're a meat robot or you have a spirit and a soul. But if you have a spirit and a soul and you're not a meat robot, then there's the supernatural. Okay? If there's a supernatural world as well as a natural world, it has to have some sort of laws. But they can't be the laws of nature. The laws of nature are when things happen by necessity. So if it doesn't happen by necessity, it has to happen by a will. And the only thing that could possibly will the laws of the supernatural world is one supreme will, one divine being, the absolute supreme being, and this all men know to be God. The fact that you think proves that God exists. That's very similar to the Cartesian argument, cogito ergo sum. Descartes wanted to prove not only that he existed, I don't know why you would want to prove that, because who you're talking to if you don't exist, but also that his existence had meaning within a divine context.
He was trying to start from first principles, one thing he couldn't doubt.
Right. And I think it's a successful argument. I don't know if he successfully proved God existed, but it's certainly harder to believe that his thoughts had meaning and were directed toward the good, unless there was a good toward which they could be directed. So I kind of believe his argument, but not. I would trust Thomas over Descartes myself. In any case, but that argument is simply that you and I can believe in the supernatural because we experience it directly every time we think. People assert that our thoughts could be explained just in terms of efficient causation, but as a lawyer, I solemnly assure you that you cannot get malice aforethought just from describing the position of my brain atoms and their measurements of their weight, shape, and velocity. That doesn't tell you what you want to know.
You could certainly never reasonably punish you if that was the case.
No, all you can do to a meat robot is reprogram it. There's no such thing as punishment.
Well, yes.
You see. You have to inflict pain on a dog. The dog has to have a spirit. A dog has to be alive. You see. And life cannot be described just in mechanical terms.
No.
People try to do it all the time, but it doesn't make any sense. Because living things all have purposes. All have a for the sake of which. Even an amoeba will move toward nutriment and away from poison. So it has intentionality in a way that a rock does not. If a rock splits in half, that's neither good nor evil for the rock. The rock does not suffer. But if an amoeba splits in half, that means it's reproducing. That means it's wedding day, I guess. So it's a good. You see, good and evil only apply to living things. That's a kind of an Ayn Randian argument. The final argument is a very pragmatic argument. Think of it as a variation of Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager said that if you don't know, if the rational arguments by themselves are not enough to convince you, then weigh what the options are. If you're wrong, if you're an atheist and you're wrong, then you'll be flung into the lake of fire for defying God. If you're an atheist and you're right, then death is merely dreamless oblivion, and you're no worse off than you were before. If you're a theist and you're wrong, then death is a dreamless oblivion, and you're no worse off than you would be otherwise. And if you're a theist and you're right, you get infinite bliss. So of the two options, one, you run a risk of infinite torment and infinite loss, and the other, you have an option of infinite bliss and infinite win. So just in terms of the mathematics of numbering yourself toward the odds, Pascal's wager is always one you should accept.
It should.
Now, keep in mind, his wager is based on the idea that reason is insufficient to tell you the correct answer. That you're judging based on just a guesswork. Okay. It's also based on the idea that you can decide what to believe in, which I don't think is the case.
Well, hang on. No, that's... I was going to say, the normal criticism you'll get is, I can't just arbitrarily choose to believe in the existence of God. The thing is... Correct. But that's not his wager. His wager is you've heard arguments from both sides, and you don't find either side convincing, but you're willing to believe either one. Well, no. He already asserts that you're willing to believe one or the other. That's part of his assumption of his wager. Sure, but I would note... I agree you cannot believe something simply by an act of will. However, in a sense, you sort of can, because...
In the case where you've heard arguments that are convincing but not totally convincing. That's the setup of the question.
But not even that. I mean, so say I decide, okay, I want to believe God exists, or I'm convinced that this would seem to be the sane way forward, and Pascal convinced me. I can start going to church. I can start praying. I can start studying St. Thomas. I can start reading the Bible. I can start doing all of these things. And if God is real, He will reveal Himself to you. You can make an intentional. You can set your will towards investigating and figuring out if this is true in a deliberate and honest fashion. So,
if I may, let me reword Pascal's wager. The wager is: should I take the time to try to believe in God, or should I take the time not to try to believe in God?
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is, I'm going to start down the path.
Effectively, yeah. I mean, that's okay. It can, because I mean, when I first joined the Catholic Church, some of it was weird, and some of it I've spent 25 years as a Protestant. I mean, this is like a little further down the path because obviously I already believe in God, but But a lot of things that were weird and strange and I was unsure of have come to make sense, and I've gathered a better appreciation by trying it, living it, and doing it, that I never would have gotten if I hadn't tried.
Right.
But now I'm convinced. I mean,
We've all heard the old phrase, seeing is believing. But the psychological reality of the way human beings actually act is believing is seeing. There's plenty of evidence to prove that God exists.
Yeah.
And for my Protestant friends, with all due respect, there's plenty of evidence that the Catholic Church is what she says she is, and is not the whore of Babylon, and is not a big trick, and is not a scheme, like or whatever you say it is. Well, you have to believe that first in order to see it, because once you believe it, you'll look into it and you'll see the evidence, and it'll be obvious. It'll be allowed as a church bell from a rooftop. Okay. The same thing for believing in God. Once you see it, you can't not see it.
Yeah.
You can't unsee it.
You can't unsee it.
And the final argument, which ties into Pascal's wager, is this. We've seen what societies that don't believe in God end up looking like. They end up in the Nietzschean position of having people say, I can be a man or a woman based on my willpower, regardless of what physical body biology has set me in.
Men can get
That's just a
pregnant.
social construct.
Yeah.
A is equal to not A. A thing is what it is not, and not is what it is. They just go mad.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, we should point out too, like, what we're not saying here. So you can look at the French Revolution, or you can look at the nightmare that was a century of communism. And
I wish people would.
Well, okay.
We all know about the Nazi horrors, and no one knows about the commie horrors, and they were worse.
Sure, but I mean,
yes, I'm sorry. Pardon me. I interrupted.
that's fine.
Pardon me, go ahead.
But like, you can look at those and go, these were materialist atheist societies deliberately engendered along these lines, and people will go, duh, blah, blah, no, that doesn't count. It was a religion for them, blah, and they make it all right. Fine, let's concede for the sake of argument. Fine, it doesn't count.
Sure.
20, 30 years ago, in your and my lifetime, certainly in the late 90s, early aughts, we saw the rise of the new atheist movement with Dawkins and Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and the like, going,
Right.
Society will be rational and wonderful, and we will usher in a new paradise when everybody has thrown off the shackles of religion. And now...
Those were the guys, I have to mention, those are the guys who talked me into being a theist. Just by the way, they talked me into being a monotheist with their crazy talk.
Well, I never found that. I didn't find their arguments particularly.
No, that's
convincing
why.
when I
That's why
encountered them, but
I disbelieved in God for what I thought was perfectly logical reasons. They gave reasons that were not logical, and I said nobody shoots blanks when he has ammo. So there's something wrong with my arguments. That's
Sure.
what set me on the path to disbelieving my disbelief. I became
enough.
skeptical of my skepticism.
fair enough.
Those guys were lunatics. I'm sorry.
But
They were utopians.
in a
They were
sense,
utopians.
But in a sense, they've won. Sort of. They've won today. Society is far more secular and far less religious. Certainly, at institutions of higher learning and things like that, things are aggressively secular, and
Yep.
the fruit of that is people insisting with a straight face and apparently genuinely believing men can get pregnant.
And have periods.
And I mean, they believe all sorts of other stupid things, but presumably anybody who's listening to this who is an atheist is certainly not going to be on board with men can get pregnant. I mean, you can't reason with someone that talks like that thinks something like that. They've abandoned reason entirely. But that is the fruit of this new. I mean, that new atheist movement was completely taken over and destroyed by the social justice warriors because they had absolutely no defense. They had no rational defense against them.
Right. In fact, there's a famous story of Hitchens being caught in an elevator by social justice warriors, and when they made the same claims to him that he used to make towards religion, he had no answer. Even though their claims were absolutely positively insane. I can't recall the details of the story. I'm sorry. But this is the thing. This is the thing that. In terms of evidence for God, we've done the experiment of what life is like without religion. And without religion, your universities turn into seminaries for Antichrist. You see, for anti-religion, because there really is no neutral ground.
No.
Either you're for God or you're against Him. Okay, that's the reality. Either you're for the good or you're against the good. Either you're for reality or against reality. Either you're for logic, even if you're not logical yourself, you want to be logical, or you're against logic. Either you're for virtue or you're against it.
You're for the true, the good, and the beautiful, or you're at war with it.
Or you're at war. Right. Now, the problem
side,
with being at war with the true...
Which side is at war with the true, the good, and the beautiful today?
Right. Just look at how... Do the LGBTQ activists who go to testify in front of legislators, when they dress up with face paint and horns and look like devils, do they look beautiful to you? Do these people look physically attractive to you when they're dressed up in their full regalia?
Or good for that matter. True, good, or
do
beautiful.
their parades, would they perform the same parades if we weren't around? Because I think that you could have a Corpus Christi parade even in a land where there was no atheists. We don't need it to rub it in the noses of our enemies. But they need us. They have to be priding in front of us to shock us. Otherwise, there's no point in the behavior. You see? So the atheist society can only exist in reaction to and retaliation against the monotheist society. It's a parasite that lives off us. It feeds off our lifeblood. We can do without them, and they can't do without us, because even the Soviet Union had to borrow money from the West. It had to adopt the moral rule that it adopted, which is care for the poor. Doesn't make any sense in a secular society. Why should you care for the poor? If there's no God, the poor are weak. The poor have no influence. How is it to your Machiavellian self-interest to help the poor? It costs you money. It costs you effort. It's not.
It's not.
It's not. And they did. And in fact, Soviet Russia did not help the poor. The poor are far poorer off in the Soviet Union than they were in America. Why do you think the Berlin Wall was only meant to stop one?
Only stop people getting out. Yeah.
East to west. Right.
No, nobody gets on a bottle raft and travels to Cuba.
Right, and that's another argument. If God did not exist, then that wouldn't happen. If God didn't exist, people would not want to go away from godless lands into godly lands. Because why would they?
Because they should be fine. Yes. Well, on that note. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Yes. Follow God, because the other path is madness.
And if you put reality on trial and you decide reality is not real, you wipe yourself out too. That's the problem.
You've made an error. Yes.
Yeah, check your premises.
Well, thank you, everybody. Like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed this. Talk to you next time.